Order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Tuesday, the 22nd of January 2026. A month has almost gone by in this year. This committee reported on the water sector regulation in July of last year, concluding that the water system had been left to sink for far too long. I don't know how water can sink, but I meant to alter that. With customers expected to shoulder the burden of water companies' failings. Over the last few weeks, we've seen tens of thousands of households and businesses without access to water for days across the south of England. It's estimated that the sector needs to spend almost $290 billion on improvements to the water infrastructure sector over the next 25 years, with an additional $52 billion to meet supply challenges. The Independent Water Commission, chaired by Sir John Cunliffe, published their findings from a review of the water sector in the summer of last year, outlining a need for fundamental reset of the system. And following the review, the government announced the abolition of Ofwat and the creation of a new singular regulator, which we'll hear much more about today, I'm sure, for water functions. Earlier this week, the government published its white paper on the new vision for water, which sets out the government's plans to reform the water sector and the wider water sector, whatever that means. Today's session will be an opportunity to examine what progress there has been since the committee's inquiry in July last year, including plans to set out in the white paper and address concerns about financial resilience and consumer trust within the sector. So to help us with all that pretty broad and convoluted sector, we're very pleased to welcome this morning David Hill. David, as everybody knows, appeared before this committee many times before. David, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Morning, Chair. Yes, I'm David Hill. I'm Director General Strategy and Water in DEFRA.
Chris, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Good morning, everyone. My name's Chris Walters. I'm the Interim Chief Executive of Ofwat.
Thank you. And Helen, you.
Good morning. I'm Helen Campbell. I'm the Executive Director for Delivery in Ofwat.
Welcome to both of you, because you haven't been before the committee, and we're very keen to hear what you have to say, because I am optimistic that what you're doing is going to lead to huge improvements. So I hope my optimism will be confirmed by you both. So welcome. And to start us off with all that, could I ask Lloyd Hatton to begin, please?
Thank you, Chair. All three of you will no doubt have seen the recent media reports in the Guardian newspaper, which reported that the bosses of Wessex Water, water firm that serves my constituency, received some £50,000 in previously undisclosed extra pay from a parent company last year. I think this is something which has obviously sort of drawn in a lot of public interest in light of the fact that we are meant to have a bonuses ban. So I'd be really keen to hear from Chris and David about how we make sure, particularly with a new single water regulator, that water companies with complex corporate structures are not able to sidestep the bonuses ban and actually use those structures to put undisclosed extra pay behind their bosses. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much for the question. There are provisions in the Water Special Measures Act which give powers to Ofwat, as well as recommendations in the Independent Water Commission report that are given effect will be given effect by the white paper that deal with those things. I think, David, if I could turn to you for the Water Special Measures Act, and then Helen in terms of implementation of those powers in Ofwat.
Yeah. So the Water Special Measures Act introduced the ability for the regulator to prescribe bonuses in certain circumstances,
which did happen in the case of Wessex Water.
Which did happen in the case of Wessex Water, alongside another 5 companies, and in total around £4 million worth of bonuses across the sector were banned for the previous reporting year, and bonuses can't be paid in circumstances where a water company is found to be in breach of a principal statutory duty, insufficient credit ratings, is convicted of certain criminal offences within the sector, or a serious environmental failure, so a Category 1 pollution incident, or is rated as a 1-star performing company under the Environment Agency's performance methodology. So that's what applies to the regulated companies. In the specific case you've highlighted, I understand that the payment in question was made to the individual in their capacity as chief exec of a holding company which has a broader range of responsibilities.
I don't think that's quite correct. I think you're referring to a former chief executive.
I beg your pardon, the former.
I'm talking about another case that was reported just days ago in the Guardian newspaper, where the current chief executive and the current chief finance officer both received well over £20,000 in previously undisclosed extra pay. So I'm aware of why bonuses bans are put in place, and I know you've given us the reason. I'm sure most of the committee are aware of the reasons why bonus bans are implemented. What I want to know is, why is it that we wait for a report in the Guardian newspaper to understand exactly how water companies are operating and how they use those complex corporate structures to put extra pay behind their bosses? Because at the moment we find out more from the Guardian than we do from either Ofwat or any of the other existing regulatory bodies that are meant to be looking at how the water sector operates.
Forgive me, I thought in your original question I heard reference to the former chief exec's position.
I've got all that as well. We can go over that too.
No, I understand. I thought that's what I heard in your opening question. I might ask Helen to comment, because Ofwat actually policed this. What I would say is Ofwat have specifically highlighted this lack of transparency around other forms of remuneration, and I understand Ofwat are going to explore what further measures can be taken around that lack of transparency. But I would also just, and I think the Secretary of State made this very clear in the House yesterday in her oral statement, ministers expect water company senior executives to respect both the spirit as well as the letter of the law. But perhaps I'll bring Helen in.
Yep. I think that's absolutely right, and the public trust that you talk about there will only be restored when there is transparency, and the decisions that are taken at board level and at remuneration committee levels clearly reflect the interests of customers and the environment. In the specific case that you're talking about, it was not in relation to the regulated company, and it was not a payment that was linked to performance. Nonetheless, so it didn't therefore fall under the Water Special Measures Act that we have.
Isn't this the exact problem? We see these water companies just happening to be one part of a complex and opaque web of companies, and therefore the Act as it stands is perhaps not tough enough. I really would like to know what are Ofwat actually able to do to look at the whole web of companies and have a clear picture of whether or not bonuses are being paid. They may not be labelled as bonuses, but that is essentially what they are. Because right now, bill payers in my constituency are finding out more from a journalist than they are from the actual regulator that should be looking into this.
Absolutely, and companies have a responsibility to be as transparent as possible. What we did after the publication of the executive pay report that Ofwat publishes every November is that we called on companies to increase their transparency and to make it very clear where there are payments that are made to executive directors on behalf of group companies, that those are clearly reported, the values are reported, and the rationale is reported.
In your judgment, do you think that happened in this Wessex water incident?
There is more to do.
So in your judgment, that didn't happen despite the calls of the regulator with Wessex Water, they were actually operating in quite a secret and shadowy way?
I think there's definitely space for more transparency, and in the report we called out for companies to be more transparent. This week I met all of the chairs of the remuneration committees to have exactly this conversation, and they recognised that there is a need to be really clear about the decisions that they take, how they relate to performance, and how they support delivery for customers and the environment.
Briefly, just to follow up the example, obviously I represent Shipley constituency. They're served by Yorkshire Water, very similar, 9 holding companies that make up the wider group of Kelder Holdings. CEO Nicola Shaw, in addition to her, I think for most people, very, very high levels of pay despite a failing company that's breaching, whether it's in pollution discharges or other things. And there as well, a very similar model where over 2 years she received £1.3 million additional to her already very substantial salary. And, you were saying about transparency. The justification for this was coming from the shareholders for shareholder-related work. Well, I've worked as a chief exec. Working with my board of trustees is part of the job. It isn't additional work, and I do not think that these are justifications for basically getting around, as you say, the spirit of the special measures bonus ban. So I'm really keen to hear, I think, further action that you believe you can take under the current law, or whether you think you need stronger powers to crack down on the water companies evading the bonus ban, because I don't think you can call that anything other than what it is.
We regulate the regulated company, and our powers extend to the payments that are made in relation to that. What we have done is require companies, and we will be consulting on this in terms of the reporting that they put in place. So we're requiring them to be really clear and transparent in the annual reports that they send to us, and in their own reports, any payments that are made for parent company activities or for activities that sit outside of the regulated company. There is also provision in the Water Special Measures Act in terms of the complex financial structures, which your committee member referred to as well, that companies have a responsibility to explain what these structures are, why they're in place, and what their purpose is. And that will again be something that we're looking for the sector to see a step change in explanation.
Live bets, please.
Yeah, sorry. Just on this issue of water, of Yorkshire.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a failing company, host pipe dams all summer, and then people see this scandal of the chief executive not simply getting paid the great sum she does, but then getting this extra hidden away on the side from a parent holding company. In future, is the totality of pay to officials working for the water company, whether it comes from the company directly or from bits and pieces on the side, going to be regulated and controlled? Because otherwise, what we have here is a water company example of what effectively is brown envelope payments behind the scenes.
Yep.
It's not acceptable.
The powers that we have sit around the regulated company. We do not regulate the parent company.
Right. So that even in the future, parent companies, holding companies won't be regulated.
That's what I was going to probe on.
No. Okay.
So, David, the question really is, you can hear the committee's dissatisfaction,
Absolutely,
and I have greater dissatisfaction than anybody because most of my constituents are served by Thames. I think our constituents are fed up with these water companies setting up these very complex corporate arrangements. They've been doing it virtually ever since privatisation. Will the Water Special Measures Act give sufficient anti-avoidance provisions to allow the regulator to really take tough action in this field?
I think ministers would absolutely share the committee's dissatisfaction with any payments that lack transparency and appear to be going around the provisions of the Act. Ofwat have said some of the examples we've seen are not acceptable and are looking further at the circumstances around those. And I think, as ministers signalled, there is an intent to bring forward legislation to implement the measures announced in the white paper this week. So I think we will want to understand from Ofwat their assessment of some of the specific examples, which take a number of different forms, as you've acknowledged, and clearly there's an opportunity for ministers to think about whether any further strengthening of the legislation is needed. But I would just say water company remuneration committees understand the provisions of the Act, and as ministers said, they expect to see those remuneration committees behave in a responsible way.
I'm not sure they do. Thames had a huge fine last year for this very problem, and yet here we've got Wessex, Lloyd has articulated very clearly, Wessex doing similar things, completely in contravention of what the regulator wants. So I'm not sure the water companies, or at least some of them, have got the message yet. We need it in legislation, tough anti-avoidance legislation.
Yeah, I hear that, Chair.
Thank you very much. Catherine, please.
Thank you. And, you know, on the other side of that frustration is the frustration of the experience that customers are having whilst that is going on. So what incentives, this is probably for you, Helen, are in place to make sure that companies are minimising supply interruptions and they are maintaining the quality of the water network.
Absolutely, and it's critical that we hold companies to account for the performance that they deliver for customers. And so the way in which we hold companies to account is in the measures that are set out in the price control, which started in April 2025 for the next 5 years. So there are measures that are put in place of expectations and targets to improve supply interruptions and other performance for customers. If companies do not meet those measures, then they will face a penalty and money will be returned in the following year to customers for failing to do that.
And who will meet the cost of those penalties? Because I guess the concern is that cost is then just passed back on to the ratepayer, the taxpayer.
The cost comes out of the money that companies are able to charge customers. So they've been funded for a level of service which they have not delivered, and therefore it is fair that that money is returned back to customers. But we set the revenues on the expectation that companies can meet a level of service and therefore customers should not be paying for service that they do not receive.
And the intention is it should come off the profits that the companies are making and the bonuses that they may in some way be paid.
It comes off their opportunity to earn rewards over and above the rewards that have been set out in the price control.
So in addition to that regime of rewards and penalties for good or bad performance, which in the case of bad performance lowers customers' bills, there is also the work that we do on law enforcement. We have 8 live investigations. We have concluded a number last year, and those result either in fines which are levied on shareholders, not on customers. Fines are returned to Treasury, or an undertakings package in lieu of enforcement, where we get to direct companies' investment to fix the problem, to ensure it doesn't happen again in future, and to engage better with their communities. But the crucial point there is that the penalties regime results in lower bills for customers. The fines regime is shareholder money to fix the problem.
Okay, and I've got 2 follow-up questions. They're quite chunky, but I'll give you both. One is in relation to what you just said there, Chris, in terms of penalties and enforcement. And do we have sufficient capacity to actually enforce these penalties? Do we have the investigative capacity? Do we have the ability to make sure that that is happening in reality? Because I think there's big question marks around that. And then the sort of side part of that is, do we have the data? Do we have the information to be able to properly assess the state of water company assets and where breaches might occur? Because at the moment it all seems very retrospective. We wait for something to go wrong and then we investigate and then look backwards to try and fix it. Do we have enough to incentivise the investment we need to see to genuinely change and prevent these outages and pollution from happening?
The regime of investigations and enforcement is retrospective. That's right. There are 16 water and wastewater companies in England and Wales. On wastewater investigations, we have either active open investigations, or we have closed in the past few months investigations into all of them, levying fines of nearly £260 million. But it is true that they are retrospective. Yes, the measures in the white paper, which we hope will be given effect in the bill, strengthen those powers and also will enable us to expedite cases, in my opinion, faster than we have been able to in the past, and I know that's a very important consideration. In terms of incentivising companies to deliver on the promises of their price view, record levels of investment, a pipeline of £50 billion pipeline of 30 major projects to improve our supply resilience, there are controls in place in the price review to ensure that customers' money is ring-fenced for that investment and will be clawed back and returned to them if the benefits of that investment are not felt. And I'll hand to Helen to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just on the state of the assets.
Yes.
And do we have sufficient oversight of that?
It's companies' responsibilities to ensure that they are managing their assets in a way that delivers good service for the long term. We collect data in a number of different ways. Some of those, as you point out, about our lagging indicators, so how many, what's the frequency of mains bursts. We have also worked with the sector through the price control process to understand the condition of a number of their assets, and we used that information in setting allowances for the next 5 years to ensure that companies have sufficient funding to deliver that service. In addition to that, we are working with the sector on a reopener for this price control, where we have worked with the sector to prioritise those assets where they feel that there is a need for more investment over and above a long-run average. And we're working with them to provide a process whereby they can access funding and they can access allowances for those.
Are there efforts to bring about more transparency on this as well? Because you've referred to a few times as much transparency as possible, but actually I would suggest the phrasing should be as much transparency as is needed.
Yes.
And clearly there don't appear to be common standards against
Yes.
water companies. There are very huge differences across the country. There are some common failures, but there are big differences in performance around the country. That's
Yes.
not fair on ratepayers.
Can I just say a little bit perhaps about what we've said in the white paper on this, because I think this is a really important theme in the white paper, and I think is part of the diagnosis of the problem we face, is that there isn't sufficient transparency around asset health. And one of the things Sir John Cunliffe identified and the government agrees with is there needs to be a much stronger focus on asset health in the regulatory system. So as Helen and Chris have outlined, a number of the performance metrics right now are about once a failure of an asset has occurred. One of the things we've said this week in the white paper is we want to move away from that. We want to move towards a different set of metrics which are about regulating against asset health, also about common resilience standards across the sector, also about strengthening the technical capability of the regulator to really hold companies to account and interrogate asset health effectively. So the institution of a chief engineer in the new regulator. So putting all of that together, I think, is designed to address, I think, the problem you are highlighting. And also, I'd just say the creation of the single regulator is an important part of making sure that there is a single view of asset health across the water and wastewater system, because I think at the moment it is too fragmented, with different regulators looking at different elements of that system, but no one looking holistically at all aspects of asset health. And if I may just come back to the first question you posed about capacity, also an issue, I would just note that the Water Special Measures Act instituted new powers of cost recovery for the Environment Agency in relation to some of the work they do around inspections of water companies. That's enabling us to move from around 4,000 or so water company inspections a year to around 10,000. So a significant ramp up of Environment Agency capacity and capability to undertake water company inspections as well.
Could I just follow up on Catherine's question on assets? It's all very well doing all your computer analysis, and I gather you've got, I've read the stuff, you've got lots of new computer tools to deal with this, but I was looking for the table, I can't find it. But basically the regulator does not do any inspection of assets. I can't see how you can use all the computer tools. You're just basically going on data that the water companies give you without actually using AI to actually sample where things look not right. How are we ever going to get an accurate reflection of what the water company's assets state is really? And we know all about these pipes. Pipes are going to take 700 years to completely replace. There's a real deficit in the sector. How can this be dealt with?
We agree. Ofwat has been a very arm's-length economic regulator focusing on outcomes for many years as a result of a previous government review in 2011. We know that in order to implement a more supervisory approach to regulation, to really get alongside companies to support and challenge them on things like asset health, we need a different regime. That's why we fully support the proposals in the white paper for the appointment of a chief engineer. There are engineers in Ofwat. In fact, there are as many engineers in Ofwat as there are economists and data experts, around groups of 60 of each. Our chairman is also a engineer, and one of our senior directors is an engineer who is on the board of the Major Projects Association, which, as I'm sure you know, is an association that has the explicit goal of spreading best practice in the management of major assets, but we do accept that the move to a more supervisory approach for regulation needs to happen, and it needs to give the sorts of inspections that the regime does not have at the moment.
That's really helpful, Chris. Thank you. Anna Dixon, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to just start by focusing on the current price review, and then we'll move to how bringing a single regulator together is going to impact on the next price review. Obviously, the current price review is under some challenge because of the appeal to the CMA, and I'd like to just focus a little bit on the role of the CMA, Competition and Markets Authority. For those that are listening at home, I shouldn't use too many bits of jargon. My understanding was when you published the draft guidance, you were looking at returns of some 3.72%. That went up to 4.03%. And now, following the CMA review, it looks like the companies, following appeal, are going to be able to get returns of some 4.29%. Those changes in percentage translate to higher customer bills, don't they? And what is the justification that CMA are giving to effectively undo the work that Ofwat have done on the price review to hand companies some higher returns?
So the CMA redeterminations do increase the total allowance package, the total revenue allowance package for the disputing companies by some £550 million. Fully £500 million of that is movements in the balance of risk and return, returns to investors, which is what you're talking about, and that is driven by movements in financial markets. The CMA's position is, and has long been, that it is compelled to use the most up-to-date financial market data at its disposal when recalculating returns to investors. As you point out, in its provisional redeterminations towards the end of the last year, that increased the rate of return to investors. When we see the final redeterminations, the CMA will use a later cut-off date, so what happens to the rate of return to investors there will depend on how financial markets have moved in the intervening periods.
In the CMA's redetermination, it appears that they can open up and look at every aspect of your assumptions and modelling. One particular element seems potentially to have been reviewed in the customer's favour, which is the way that you, as of Ofwat, calculated energy costs and likely energy efficiency gains in their sort of operating expenditure. So how are you going to manage now and in the future to ensure that there's better alignment in the sort of judgment of what a fair price is between Ofwat and CMA, so that companies can't just appeal and effectively unravel what has been a lot of years of work to settle a price review that's fair to customers?
So the CMA redetermination process is a full merits review, and that contrasts with the appeal mechanism that we see across many other regulated sectors where the review standard is judicial review. The proposals in the white paper are to move towards that. They are proposals that we support. As to the impact of that change on future methodology, the white paper also points to a number of recommendations in the Independent Water Commission report for reform of the price review process. Those are proposals that we support. So whereas we might normally expect a CMA redetermination process to have a very significant impact on methodology, I think an even greater impact on methodology this time will be from the proposals in the white paper, which we expect will be given effect by the bill later in the year.
So maybe I'd just add to that, as these are sort of Chris is describing kind of some of the policy changes government intends to make. The water sector is quite unusual amongst regulated economic sectors in this sort of all or nothing approach to appeals, and the government said this week we'll move away from that, so that in future there will be an appeals mechanism, but as with other regulated economic sectors, we'll move towards something that's much more targeted on specific issues rather than a full redetermination. And then, as Chris says, there is some work going on across government, and indeed I think the NAO will also have a sort of a study looking across the economic regulators underway at the moment to look at precisely this issue about can we have more common, consistent approaches across the economic regulated sectors, for example, to questions like how the setting of the average cost of capital is done. So there'll be more to come, I think, in due course and on that cross-government work around those sorts of issues, around a kind of common methodology towards these questions.
Will all of these changes come quick enough for you to implement them in the next price review? Can you give some sense of a timeline?
That is the intention, yes, absolutely.
It might help to spell out the timeline for the price review. In order for there to be a PR29, it took us around 15 months of analysis and scrutiny and board-level decision-making to conclude PR24. We shared the government's ambition to reduce the administrative burden of that process by 25%. That would take it down to, let's call it a year. So for PR29, we need to begin, the new regulator will need to begin its scrutiny of proposals in 2028. Experience suggests it takes the companies around a year to finalise those proposals and get them signed off and assured by their boards, which will take us to the start of 2027, which means in practical terms, we have to have a clear idea by the end of this year what the methodology for the next price review is going to look like. And that is what we are aiming to include in the transition plan, which we're expecting in March.
And will that need to have legislation? Because that sounds like a very ambitious timetable to get all of that concluded in this year.
I might hand to David on the need for legislation.
No, I don't think all of that will depend on legislation. Some of those big structural changes about regulatory structures depend on legislation, but some of the mechanics of how you run the price review, I think, do not depend on primary legislation in large part. So what the government intends to do is issue a new interim strategic policy statement to Ofwat, which sets out the government's priorities for Ofwat. In parallel, a legal direction to the Environment Agency about their responsibilities, because many of the inputs into a price review are actually around delivering environmental requirements. And the transition plan in the next few months that Chris alluded to. And that's intended to essentially set the planning framework and the planning assumptions for the regulators going into the next price review. So we're not ready to publish all of that detail right now, but that's the direction of travel we set out in the white paper, and that should set out the framework for how we're going to take forward the next price review. So there'll be elements of planning for that price review that can be done on a no regrets basis, going to be needed in all circumstances, but there will be some elements of that we'd expect to see that look quite different from the last price review. So we need to get that in place this year.
The final question, just briefly, please, David. Are you confident then that all of the turmoil that will be involved in creating a new single regulator will not impact on the work of delivering PR29 under a new methodology?
Yeah, so it's that in any big structural change, of course, you've got to manage disruption to the organisations affected. I'm confident that we've got good arrangements in place with my colleagues here from Ofwat, but also the chief execs of the other regulators involved in this process, to do two things in parallel. One is plan for creating a new institution, and we've recently just scaled up and changed the DEFRA team to enable us to plan that effectively with our partner organisations. But also the regulators have got a day job to do, consistent with the powers Parliament's already conferred on them. What the government's going to do, though, is make sure that those powers are being exercised in a way that is consistent with the direction of travel in the white paper. And so we need to do both those things, but we're putting in place the arrangements to make sure that we can do that effectively this year. And I'm confident that we've got the arrangements in place to be able to minimise any disruption. The transition plan is going to be critical, because I think that's about giving all parties some certainty about what assumptions they should be planning to. And that includes the industry. We want the industry to understand what they need to do in terms of getting their business plans ready going into the next price review.
Thank you. Sorry, just one thing to add on that, if I may. Part of the reason that we have the arrangements that are split between Chris and myself is to make sure that we do maintain focus on both delivery, which is my area, to ensure that the £104 billion of price control money is spent wisely, and on the major projects. Chris is focused on the transition and supporting the new regulator. Now, clearly, we work very closely together in spirit of the direction that we're going in, but we have a strong organisational focus on both areas.
Colleagues will want to pick that up.
Thank you very much, and I've got two quick questions. One for you, David. I have got some very strong water pressure bodies in my constituents. My constituents pay a great deal of attention to these water matters. So in this PR29 price review, will the public, our constituents, the most important consumers who pay for all of this, be given adequate chance to feed into the process?
Yes, and Helen might want to sort of add a little bit about the sort of process for getting customer input into price reviews. But yes, that is absolutely the intention, that as part of the process there should be a testing with customers and consumers before the regulator makes final decisions.
Yeah,
do you want to add to that?
Absolutely. And it is a core part of what we expect companies to do, is to engage with customers and all stakeholders to ensure that their views are taken into account when they respond to the approach that we set out for the price control. I would also add that government has given us powers under the Water Special Measures Act, which is one of those powers is under setting rules of remuneration and governance for water companies, is a requirement for companies to demonstrate how they take on board consumer views in their decision making. So not just on price controls, but on all aspects of board decision making. There are now new powers that companies must must take on board consumer views.
Very helpful. And quick one for you, Chris. Are you absolutely certain that in these price determinations by the CMA that investment is still carrying on with those companies that are subject to this review procedure? Otherwise, they're going to have a shorter time in which to make the investment.
So you'll remember in one of my earlier answers, Chair, I talked about customers' money being ring-fenced for investment and clawback if that investment's not delivered. That clawback is given effect by what we call delivery plans, where companies are required to report to us on exactly that. That's very much Helen's bailiwick, so I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, and we require companies to provide regular reports to us on the progress that they make against delivery. We are clearly not completed the first year, but we are reviewing the information that companies provide us, and where we have queries, we follow up. We had a range of meetings throughout December to talk about companies' delivery and are they on track.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, Chair, if I may.
Of course.
I think if your question sort of relates to investor confidence in the sector, I think it is also just worth noting that I think since the final determination of Price Review 24, and indeed since the Cunliffe Review, I think we've seen around 2 billion of new equity committed to the sector, and certainly in the conversations we've had with the investor community, I think there's a broad support for the direction of travel of Sir John Cunliffe's reforms and now the white paper. So I think it's absolutely incumbent on us to get on with it. The sector wants certainty about the detail, and that's what the transition plan will offer. But I think we see reasonably positive prospects about maintaining investor confidence, because investors also want some of the things that the government has focused on in the white paper around a stable, predictable, secure regulatory environment, which is what we're trying to bring about.
That's a helpful answer. Let's hope we've turned the corner in relation to investment in the sector. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to probe a little bit further about the transition, as you were talking about at the end of the last set of questions. Mr. Waters, what are you doing to prepare Ofwat as an organisation, as an operation, for the becoming a new regulator, merger, whatever you're describing it as?
So Helen described earlier the way that we are restructuring ourselves. We have restructured ourselves internally so that both Helen and I report directly to board, so our board has a direct line of sight to oversight and support for delivery, but also to the work that we are doing on transition. That is very much a DEFRA-led process, but I'm pleased to be able to say that the department is including us very closely in deliberations. We are managing transition can be difficult, change is difficult for people, but what I'm very pleased about is Ofwat's an organisation where people come to work to really make a difference, and although this process can be hard, I think we recognise it's hard because it's important, and it's hard because we care, and it's hard because we want the new regulator to be on the best possible footing. So we are it is true that our turnover has crept up. Baseline staff turnover Ofwat historically is around 15%. Following a price review, we would normally expect that to increase because that's a quinquennial process. Once someone's done 5 years, it's natural that they might look for something else. To creep up to maybe 20%. Turnover at the moment is a shade over 25%. My board has taken an interest in that, of course. You would expect that. We are in the process of developing a retention and engagement action plan for our staff, as well as all the things that we normally do, and I will be reporting to a subcommittee of our board, which we call our People Committee, on that plan in March. I'd be very happy at that point, if it's helpful, to update the committee to do so.
Thank you, and I think it would be helpful to update the committee, because obviously that does create a risk for the organisation, doesn't it? A loss of skills, loss of experience. I hear what you say about the retention plan, but are there other measures you're putting in place to mitigate those risks?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Are there other steps you're taking to mitigate the risks presented by loss of skills and experience?
Yes, there are. We have revamped our employee assistance programme and the courses and the support we are offering to people going through change. We have ring-fenced within our budget money for more support payments, recognition pay payments, should I say, sorry, and priority pay adjustments for mission critical roles. Those are all things that will be included in the action plan to minimise the degree of transition. What is also true is that the white paper makes it very clear that the future regulator requires core economic skills and capabilities of the people in Ofwat. It will not be Ofwat Mark II, far from it, but the new regulator will need the core capabilities of the people.
Are you recruiting for new roles then that you haven't had within the regulator before?
So we have our headcount is around, posts around 460 for the current financial year. We have 110 vacancies and a budget of around £32 million. We are recruiting to vacancies, and we are prioritising recruitment around areas that we know are going to be important for the new regulator. We mentioned engineers earlier. I said we have as many engineers as we do economists and data experts, but we will need more engineers and we will need more data experts.
And is there a danger that you will exceed your budget for people spend?
In this financial year, it's very early to say. Holding the number of vacancies that we have, I think it is unlikely. We have also reprofiled some of our external spend and reprioritised work that is not mission critical for the new regulator. So although we are not very far through the financial year, I would be surprised if we did not slightly underspend the budget that the 2025 government spending review set for us.
Thank you. And can I also ask about your IT systems? In this committee, we're very used to looking back at the contribution that a failure of IT systems has made to failing to achieve broader outcomes. So can you tell us what Ofwat are doing to prepare their IT and other operational systems for the new regulator to make sure that it's able to deliver what it needs to deliver?
We have a brand new data ingestion strategy called Project Ocean.
So as you know, regulators it's really important that we collect the right data and that we use that data and that we analyse the data. We are in the process of replacing our old data systems to a modern Microsoft platform that will allow us to better fit the needs for the future. That process will continue, will be substantially complete in 2026. The choice of platform is standard. It is consistent with modern ways of data sharing with other organisations. We've already undertaken pilot work on data sharing with other regulators, including DWI and the Environment Agency. So we know that the investment that we're making is needed, and we know it's consistent with the direction that we will be going in with an integrated regulator.
Was that work planned before the new regulator was announced?
It was underway. We did need to modernise and upgrade our data systems.
Okay, but you're satisfied that it will be sufficient, yes. It will work well within the new environment?
Yes. Perhaps I could just add to that, because it might be worth me just saying a minute or two on the work we're doing within the department to set up preparedness for the new regulator, and indeed the full suite of the reforms in the white paper as a major programme, which it is in scale. One of the one of the work streams we're developing is around digital systems across the 4 organisations that will, subject to Parliament approving the legislation, would move into the new regulator. So that is a kind of critical work stream supported by the department's digital DDAP function as well. So that's part of, and we're doing that alongside also building our capabilities around how do you manage the, as Ms Dixon was saying, how do you manage the sort of process without disruption of a big institutional change where you're bringing together the functions of 4 distinct organisations, regular dialogue, for example, with the trades unions involved in those of the staff in those organisations about how we do that in an orderly way. It does mean quite a big shift in capabilities in the core department to run this well, so we're getting support from NISTA, the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, around how we set this up, because it's a sort of, it will be a major programme on the government portfolio.
Thank you, Chair.
Could I just follow Sarah's question, David? Notwithstanding what Chris has said, that he doesn't expect to spend his budget this year, we are expecting this new regulator to take on very considerable new duties. We heard in one of our previous sessions on water where a small investment by Ofwat in actually carrying out maintenance and repairs to some of their assets would have saved quite a bit of flooding, and I know the IDBs are very concerned about this. So notwithstanding what might happen this year, can we be absolutely sure that we're going to fund this new regulator properly? Because the industry has been under-regulated for years. Our constituents are very concerned about this. We want them to succeed.
Yes, I mean, look, this programme of reform is one of the top priorities for the department. The Secretary of State's been very clear about that. It was reflected in all of our spending review discussions with the Treasury and indeed our sort of ongoing conversations with the Treasury. So I think we are reprioritising resources within the department to make sure we can do this well, and I think ensuring that we can set this thing up in good order will be a top priority for us. Obviously, as you'll know, we can only take preparatory work forward so far until second reading of the legislation, but we can do some work now within the department and more to come once we've got second reading of the legislation.
Very helpful, thank you. Rupert Lowe, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, if I could just ask you a top-down question. I'm a great lover of Victorian Britain, and Victorian Britain believed that water and power, so clean water and cheap power, should be in public ownership. So they're far more capitalist than we are today. So listening to the debate and reading these papers, do you actually think these water companies would be better in public ownership?
I think there are differences in... We have different models of ownership in the United Kingdom. Public ownership in Northern Ireland and in Scotland. In Wales, Dŵr Cymru, Welsh Water runs on a not-for-dividend basis, and there are different, even though there are private ownership models, they differ. In England, some companies are listed and their stocks traded. Some are privately owned by one.
I know the structure, but intellectually, do you think often water companies would be better? Because I listen to this conversation and I have a concern that the skill and knowledge base, both within the civil service and within the ministerial pool, which I look at with horror, is not capable of actually holding the public's corner. And the problem is, when you have a very able private sector, which is effectively exploiting a very unable public sector, that the net cost falls upon the consumer. It's always mutualised across water bills, and we're seeing it now. So, for instance, let me give you an example. So I'm, and this isn't my area of expertise, but I look in horror that we've got all this uncertainty about the structure, and we've yet to see your paper. I don't know when that's coming out. I think it's absolutely crucial that comes out as soon as possible so everybody understands what is happening. But I look at, for instance, the Thames Water situation, hugely indebted. I fear that when Thames Water, if we're not careful, that without the skill and knowledge base within your group or within the ministerial group, the private sector will take advantage, the hedge funds will basically take advantage of the debt they have, and they will turn it to their advantage and to the disadvantage of the consumer. I look at, for instance, Macquarie Bank, who played a big part in structuring that. They're now involved, I think they're a shareholder in Southern Water. So I just look and I'm my hat on this one is with the consumer, because we want clean water and we want water that's correctly priced. So I think it's crucial that you get your paper out as soon as possible, and I'd like you to reassure the committee, assuming we aren't going to take water into public ownership, which to shock Anna, I sort of half of me thinks that we'd be better that way. But what are you going to do to really give the committee confidence that the people who are going to be dealing with this will have the skill set to stand the corner of the consumer, who ultimately ends up paying for all this?
Can I have a go at answering your question? So on the question of public ownership, I think ministers have been very clear, and you'll have heard the Secretary of State in the House yesterday, that ministers don't believe public ownership is the right answer. Estimated cost of nationalising the sector of the order of £100 billion, based on our estimates, and we've published a paper which I can direct you after the session if that's helpful. And of course it would take, you rightly I think pointed to the sort of potential risks of disruption in any organisational change. I think important to say that any process of returning the sector to public ownership would take many years of disruption. So I think the judgment of ministers is there is a huge amount we can do to improve the way the current system works. I think your challenge on do the regulators have the right teeth and the right capabilities to do that well? I think the government would accept the premise of your question.
Not just the teeth, the capability. The capability is the key here.
I agree.
Because you've got a mismatch between the capability in the private sector and the capability in the public sector, I'm afraid. And everything we're talking about now is over-complex. So my view is that in the past, Ofwat's been definitely regulatory captured. I mean, when things get too complex, it ends up being a pig deal. Forget all the papers and the structures and the plans. It ends up being a pig deal between the regulator and the private sector. It just inevitably does. So I'm just worried that with all this mess, now is not the time to have an uncertain situation. I think you were due to have this report out, was it in September? And you're hoping to have this structure out in January. It was January. I mean, when are we going to see it?
The white paper.
I've seen there's a white paper, but when are we actually going to have a firm structure so everybody knows what's happening? Because I think that the Ofwat is dysfunctional. I think the DEFRA is dysfunctional. I think the Environment Agency is dysfunctional. I don't know about the Drinking Water Inspectorate. So put them all together, you end up with one big mess if you're not careful. So I think we want to know that the consumer is being looked after here, and that the private sector isn't going to further take advantage of what I think is a mismatch in capabilities.
So, on your question about capability, and Sir John Cunliffe had a long, hard look at this, and you'll have seen his report published summer last year. He did recommend we need a regulator with a different set of capabilities and move to a different model of regulation with a much stronger focus on supervisory regulation, and he drew on his experience in financial services as part of forming that recommendation. And that's one of the things we now need to build in the new regulator, and that supervisory capability should extend to some of the things we were talking about before, so much stronger engineering expertise in the regulator to really understand the engineering and technical challenges facing individual water companies, but also extend to financial supervision as well. And we had questions earlier about the sort of complexity of some of the financing. So yes, that's the regulators today will look quite different in the future, and the government's following Cunliffe's recommendations on those points. On the timing of that, I accept the challenge that the government has announced its policy intent in the white paper this week. We do need to move quickly, and that's the transition plan that I was talking about, which we aim to get out in the next couple of months, which is the real detail of how we plan and prepare for all of those reforms. And on your final question about consumer protection, I would strongly agree that consumer protection needs to be strengthened, and that's one of the reasons why in the white paper the government committed to establishing a new independent ombudsman for the sector with statutory force to ensure that there's much stronger mechanisms of redress for customers and consumers than currently exist.
So fine words, thank you for those, but when are we actually going to know what the structure is and who's going to populate that structure? When are we going to know that?
So we're intending to set out that level of detail in the transition plan in the next couple of months.
And then we can judge whether they're up to the job.
Obviously, what comes next is legislation, and I can't preempt the King's speech, but to do this well, and the scale of reform we're talking about, you need primary legislation for a number of these reforms. But we will be working with the regulators, we'll be working with the industry quite closely to make sure that as that detail's built up, we'll share all of that, and we'll obviously happily share that with the committee.
And if I could just add, firstly, forgive me for misunderstanding the initial thrust of your point. The system that is changing is one where 4 separate regulators are responsible for overseeing the sector. There are gaps and overlaps and inconsistencies and responsibilities, and that is a cause of the situation we now find ourselves in, and that is what the white paper and the transition plan and the bill, when they arrive, seek to address. If I could just pick up on your point about regulatory capture, that perhaps I would say this, but that's not what my organisation feels like to me. And if I look at some of the comments that
I'm not blaming you, you've only been there for a nanosecond. I'm in the history of it. I wouldn't blame you.
You're very
You haven't been there long
Thank you.
enough.
But if you look at the comments some of the comments that went in to Sir John Cunliffe's commission, there are as many saying we have Ofwat has been too pro-customer as saying the opposite.
Thank you, Chairman. We need this structure and the people as soon as possible. And it doesn't fill me with great confidence to hear there's a whole load of legislation that's got to be passed first. That sounds like a long time to me.
Well, we'll do it as fast as we can, but it's the biggest set of changes to the sector since privatisation. So, but there's a lot we can do in advance of legislation. And
Thank you for that. Could I ask our witnesses to speak up a bit? Some committee members are having difficulty hearing, so clear speaking up, please, would be really helpful. Sarah Green, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on what Rupert was just saying, on the transition period we're talking about, you said that plan will be published in the next couple of months. Do you mean before the King's speech, or what's the time frame you're working to specifically in the next couple of months?
Yeah, 2 different. So the transition. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, transition plan next couple of months. It's not dependent on the timing of the King's speech.
So you're cracking on with that anyway.
We're getting on with that.
Okay, thank you. I'm keen to better understand what the future looks like and what you anticipate. And it's a question for all of the panel really. How the new regulatory structure, because you're right, there are 4 at the moment coming into 1 and filling in the gaps. I'm keen to understand how you anticipate that will improve not just consumer trust, but also transparency. Like, what does good look like in the future?
Well, I'm the person responsible for the new bits, I suppose. So I think a number of things. One is, and a lot of this is informed by Sir John's recommendations. One is, I think, one of the things he said was there's insufficient clarity about what are the big priorities for the sector, whether that's environmental outcomes, whether that's affordability for customers, whether that's about a long-term plan for the resilience of assets. And I think one element of the future will be a much stronger and clearer statement from government about the big strategic priorities for the sector, to give much more certainty for everyone involved, not just water companies, but also others who have a big impact on environmental quality, like in agriculture, about what we're trying to achieve. Second big thing is about a much more joined up approach to regulation. So, as Chris says, we've got 4 different regulators, all regulating different bits of the water system, and that has led to overlap and duplication in some areas, and we've seen that and we've heard that very clearly. In some areas, you can look at urban wastewater treatment regulation as an example of that, but it's also led to gaps, and we've talked a lot about asset health, and I would say that there is a gap in how we regulate for asset health. So we need a much more joined up, single guiding mind about how do you balance your environmental objectives, your affordability for consumers, and the financial sustainability of the system. And then I think we need a system that it creates the conditions to attract investment into the sector. And so that's about ensuring that we avoid the problems we've seen in some water companies of chronic underperformance and chronic lack of financial resilience, but we're also capable of giving investors some stability and certainty and predictability. And that's why in the future, whilst we have 5-yearly price reviews, we'll also make sure there's a much stronger 10 or 25-year time horizon for big infrastructure, because this is the infrastructure programme, even in this price review period, is the second largest infrastructure investment in any sector of the economy over this Parliament. But that will continue in the future, and many of the projects we're talking about, take longer than any one price review to deliver. So part of what good will look like in the future is a much, much longer planning horizon for planning of major infrastructure. So that's a flavour, I think, of what we're trying to achieve.
If I can just ask specifically about asset health, and I think, Chris, you mentioned the recruitment of a chief engineer. What difference will that make? Because you already have engineers. What difference will having somebody as a head honcho?
Perhaps I can pick that one up. And the chief engineer is a theme of the white paper that's come out and for the future regulator. But as Chris sets out, we have been taking steps in Ofwat to increase our engineering capacity and to be able to therefore address some of the gaps that we've had in the knowledge and oversight of the asset health and asset condition in the sector. That's part of the reason why I was brought on board 2 years ago. A large part of the growth in Ofwat's numbers that Chris referred to has been in the team that I have built, from 30 to over 150 people now.
Repeat that number for me. From 30?
From about 30 to around 150 people. That includes specialists that are looking at all areas of companies' performance, but I have a team that did not exist previously that is focused on engineering, operations and asset management. And we are working very closely with the sector to develop the kind of measures that you've talked about there that are really important for us to be able to have that oversight and understanding of the condition of the assets. But I would also just go back to the point I made earlier that this is absolutely the responsibility for companies to understand their assets, to understand what investment is needed in those assets and to bring forward well-justified plans for us as a regulator to assess.
Can I just ask about enforcement, if I may? And I appreciate the Environment Agency isn't sat in front of us, but as a constituency MP, there is deep frustration in my own constituency with just one example in Chalfont St Peter, where there was a major incident 2 years ago, and here we are in 2026, and though the Environment Agency's been out to see it, they've not seen or heard anything since. And two or 3 years ago, the EA were very open that they were no longer investigating Category 3 and Category 4 incidents. So my question really for you, David, is if the current Environment Agency isn't able, because of resourcing issues, to do some of the work the public expects them to do, what confidence can they have that shifting that responsibility over, they will have not just the capability that you were talking about and the teeth, but the resources to do what they need to do?
Yeah. So, and I'd be very happy to pick up any specific points with the Chief Executive of the Environment Agency. And there is a backlog on enforcement, and you'll see in the white paper there's some commitments there around the time frame for clearing that backlog, and I know I'd be very happy to get the Chief Exec.
Could you update the committee in a note?
Very happy to. Really very happy to do it. In fact, I think you
have instances that we could reference.
I think you've got the Chief Exec in front of you in 2 weeks' time as well.
You all done?
But sorry, I was just going to come back on your point about capacity. So I think the powers in the Water Special Measures Act are important because they're significantly increasing the ability of the Environment Agency to cost recover from the companies they regulate to ramp up their investigation and enforcement capability. So I think that's sort of without prejudice to everything we're talking about structural change,
Yeah.
we are increasing the powers to strengthen the funding streams to support that work, and there's been a significant increase in their resources available to do that, which is why they're able to make the commitments to clear the backlog.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
I'm going to get Lloyd next, and after which we're going to take a break, and then hopefully we will sprint towards the finish. So, Lloyd Hatton, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure everybody here has been fairly appalled by the significant water supply outages across much of the southeast of England. In 2023, Ofwat launched an investigation into southeast water, looking at these supply outages. That investigation, over 2 years old, has not concluded, and it has not come forward with any actions or recommendations. And of course, in light of what we've seen happen in recent weeks, Ofwat have launched another investigation, an emergency investigation, looking into major supply shortages with southeast water. It feels like this is an incredibly slow and reactive way of working, and actually we are unable, therefore, to bear down on failing water companies when they preside over serious water outages. So can you reassure us that actually a new single water regulator will do a better job than Ofwat, and will be able to actually be much more proactive in holding to account failing water companies such as Southeast Water?
So it's correct to say the investigation we opened into Southeast Water's supply resilience, or lack thereof, was November 2023.
Yeah.
We hope to conclude that very, very shortly indeed, but because it is an open investigation, you'll appreciate there is a limit to how much I can say around timing. It is also true that following the awful events in Tunbridge Wells, I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for people there. We did open an investigation into Southeast Water, but how it has engaged with its customers. Part of the reason the supply resilience investigation took the amount of time it took is because it relies on very complicated engineering information. As we have been discussing, assessing supply resilience and resilience standards is a very complicated thing to do, and it is always our ambition to expedite these investigations, but of course parties have rights of defence and they have to be respected as well. The reason I say that is because...
When you say parties have rights to defence, you're talking about Southeast Water.
Southeast Water, yes. They have the right to make representations and to put...
It does seem to feel, to people living particularly in the Southeast, but I imagine to everyone in this committee, that they would be defending the indefensible. And actually we have seen long-term problems across much of the southeast of England where there have been significant and repeated water outages. And actually this pace of working feels very slow, very clunky and very reactive. And they would want to see a new water regulator be much tougher, yes, much quicker and much more proactive, so we can actually sort of set aside what Southeast Water have to say for themselves and actually get on with sorting the problem that is causing so much devastation and disruption across the southeast.
We absolutely share that ambition, and it is our goal for the new regulator for England to do exactly that. The southeast of England is a water-stressed part of the world, yeah, and the Southeast Water received allowances of almost £230 million in our recent price review. It requested £295 million. We concluded that some of what it asked for, its customers are already paid for, yeah, and some of that was inefficiency. Southeast Water is one of the companies that has appealed our determination to the CMA, which is largely upholding our position. However, the CMA has allowed a small extra amount because Southeast Water has been able, I'm pleased to say, to bring forward better evidence around the need for that. And the reason I bring that up is because that illustrates the complexity of exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, which is why the investigations take the amount of time they take. But yes, we do absolutely share the committee's ambition to do these faster. If I could just return to the case about Southeast Water's engagement with its customers, there the criteria are not about engineering resilience. There are 5 simple criteria in the customer-focused licence condition, condition G, which we can investigate, and it is our goal to do that much quicker than we have done.
So one last quick question: when will the first investigation likely conclude? Can we get a date? And when will this second emergency investigation
I cannot
likely
give you a
conclude?
precise date. I can say it will be very shortly indeed. It is our ambition to conclude the second investigation as soon as possible, and by that I mean months and not years.
It's a quick question for me, then I'm going to take a break. It does seem to me that what we need is part of your PR29 process, a risk register which is constantly updated of all water companies with their highest risks, so that you can start to direct investment to try and prevent these sort of things happening again. Because as you say, what has happened, particularly in the southeast, is completely unacceptable for water consumers anywhere in the country.
We agree, and some of the proposals that we have been putting into the department around what supervision looks like in practice do exactly that. Helen, I don't know if you want to say anything.
No, I think that's right.
Very
Yeah.
much. Very helpful. Thank you. So we're going to take a short break. The clock stands at almost 11:15. If we can try and be back here by 11:20, and as I say, then we'll cover a few things that we've not already covered. So thank you so much to our witnesses so far and all colleagues for their forbearance. I know there's a lot to cover here. Order. Order. We'll now restart today's session. So I'm going to count down to broadcasting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You already pressed the button. Well done. We're going to start with Tris Osborne, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to be my questions are just linked to the IWC's concerns around financial resilience and investor confidence. And my colleague, I suspect, will pick up on some of my points. I was surprised when you said earlier that the sector that you felt there was investor confidence in the sector. The credit rating agencies have done numerous reports on the water industry since 2018 and have downgraded the sector numerous times. And one of the major reasons is because of poor regulatory oversight, in their words. So are you saying today, I mean, we're moving towards a new regulatory regime, but can you really say that Ofwat has delivered investor confidence from a market's perspective?
So I think what the point I was trying to make was that there was positive, in our conversations, positive investor response to the direction of travel of the reforms that the IWC was recommending in terms of the steps we're now proposing to take. So I wasn't saying, and you're absolutely right, there has been sector-wide downgrades by the credit rating agencies over the last few years. But what I was saying was there are signs that the direction of travel of the reforms predicated in the IWC report, and which the white paper now confirms the government will take forward, I think investors, broadly speaking, can't speak for all of them, but in our conversations would say that's the right way to go. But clearly they want to see more in terms of the detail, as Mr. Lowe was asking about earlier. So that was the point I was making.
Okay. If I could just probe on those reforms, because actually the investor sentiment, so if I look at investor sentiment, they're concerned that the white paper actually yesterday doesn't have enough clarity on some of those reforms. If I might push back on what you've just said, the transition plan you've clarified is going to be published within months. It would be helpful if we could have a bit more certainty on that. And also whether or not there'll be a shadow regulator as well. I think that's a major concern in the markets, that is there going to be, like we've seen that in other organisations such as in the energy space. And there's also a lack of clarity around the new regulator's scope. So Ofwat has a parliamentary, you're required to report to Parliament. It is a tier 1 sort of regulator in that sense. What is this new regulator's scope going to be? Is it going to have that same parliamentary scrutiny as previous? So there are outstanding questions, aren't there? Will they all be clarified in this transition paper?
That's the goal. So the white paper is the government's substantive response to Sir John Cunliffe's recommendations in the round. So, and there were a whole range of issues that the government needed to set out what its policy was going to be on Cunliffe's recommendations. The white paper aims to do that. You're right, it doesn't give all of the level of detail that we know investors and others want and need, but that's the commitment for the next phase of the work. On your question around a shadow regulator, you'll see, and ministers confirmed, there is an intent to make early appointments as soon as possible in terms of shadow roles. So we absolutely hear the views expressed by industry about the need to see some of that new leadership and some of the new capabilities being brought into this. So we would envisage, consistent with all of the normal rules about not getting ahead of parliamentary scrutiny of the legislation, but we would expect to see early appointments. And on your question about accountability, parliamentary accountability, the detail is still to be worked through, but I don't envisage any circumstances where the new body would have any less degree of accountability to Parliament than Ofwat currently does.
Okay, I appreciate those answers. One of the other concerns from an investor's perspective is that they're concerned that Ofwat had too many strategic policy statements. So you had, as I understand it, 59 of these, which created, as Rupert rightly raised, the fact that you had a dearth of regulation, but where was the focus in those SPSs? So is, again, from an investor confidence perspective, will you be defining this much more tightly? than the 59 statements that we've had previously.
I think one statement, but 59 different commitments, I think is the point they're making. But the short answer to your question is yes. Will there be a much simpler, pared back set of objectives for the new regulator? The answer is yes. We're committed more broadly across the water system as a whole. There are far too many different plans, strategies, etc. And we're committed to reducing that to two planning frameworks. One that relates to the environment, and one that relates to water supply and the safety and security of long-term water supplies. So that's the job we now need to do, to simplify that down to two planning frameworks, and that'll be the framework within which water companies and the regulator work in the future.
The reason why I ask those questions is because investor confidence is critical, because if we lose that, and at the moment there is still uncertainty with investors around where we're heading, this will add bills to people. Oxera Consultants have said £27 a year will be added if we don't, that they've calculated is the regulatory burden if we don't have clarity on where we are. Now, I'm not asking you to comment on that because it's obviously not in the report, but the point is that that transition plan needs to be quite tight in terms of its scale, scope and remit if investors are to maintain confidence in a sector which has had a decline in confidence for 5 years.
Yes, so I'm happy to comment. I mean, I won't comment on the specific figure that you quoted, but it is an objective of the reforms to reduce the overhead associated with complying with the regulatory frameworks in the sector. I mean, my Ofwat colleagues will confirm, but I think we estimated that the total cost to water companies and therefore to customers of preparing for the last price review was in the sort of order of £250 million in terms of some of the preparatory work that needed to be done on business plans. We want to see that number radically reduced, and part of that is about much simpler, clearer, common sets of objectives that everyone can work to. So I think we're with you on the spirit of your question.
And just lastly, because I understand my colleague is going to pick up on other aspects, financial resilience is critical. Ofwat has presided arguably over a period where we've got a significant number of companies in financial distress. Their ratings have also decreased. So there is a crisis of confidence in this sector at the moment. If you look at the overall sector, it's been downgraded. If you look at individual companies, we're on BAA1 in many cases for some of these companies, which is making it very difficult for them to capital raise. There is a conversation out there around mutualising debt around a number of companies. Is there validity in that conversation where we could mutualise some of this debt collectively so that we can get better confidence from the market in terms of investment if we were to lose a private sector option?
I might bring Helen in to comment, but just to say a couple of things first. So financial resilience of the sector is a critical priority of the reforms. You'll see we've made some commitments, for example, around ensuring the new regulator has the powers to ensure that companies don't acquire unmanageable levels of debt. On mutualisation, I think we would expect the new regulator to be guided by what is the best model for the customers of any individual company. We see different models, Welsh Water obviously, but we've also seen mutualisation proposals rejected in the past where the regulator wasn't satisfied it was in the best interests of customers. So I think, and you'll have heard the Secretary of State's remarks in the House yesterday on mutualisation. So I think, but strengthening financial resilience through all of the things we've been talking about, clearer, more predictable regulation, stronger supervisory approaches, looking at some of the tools the regulator has in their toolkit, strengthen what they can do now, all of that is an important part. But Helen might want to add to that. I guess
I'd just make a broader point about investor confidence, and obviously Ofwat has a very key role to ensure that there is that confidence, and the way in which we do that in part is through setting the price control. That price control has set out, as you know, a record £104 million, and we believe that we've calibrated that price control such that it is attractive for investors. We monitor market signals very closely. One of the market signals that is more easily to observe is the market asset ratio for listed companies. So that's the ratio over and above which they are valued against their regulatory capital base. We would observe that very recently a market asset ratio over 100% it means that they are trading at their value. Long-term trends have been around 110%, and we observe that there has been the market asset ratios for listed companies are around 113%. So that is a clear signal that there is confidence. I appreciate that there are a number of other ownership models in the sector, but we are committed to ensure that we have a regulatory framework that is predictable, that is financeable and that is fair to customers, and we'll be obviously working alongside the recommendations in the that come through on the white paper to support the direction that government's going in.
Just one last question, if I may. Part of the reason why we're here is after the general election, it was very clear that the regulator, in the public's view, was not working. So John Cunliffe concluded that there were many elements that weren't working either. And yet it's a surprise that when we look at your non-executive appointments, you've kept some of the same people in post that have seen the same 5 years of decline in terms of credit ratings, in terms of reputational liability. That makes me question. My worry is the same people who were involved in this regulator, which has been lambasted, or in my view, are just simply going to transfer over to the next one. So, are you really able to? I mean, the non-executive appointments surprise me actually. So, can you give me any confidence that we're not just going to see a movement of the same people with the same business as usual approach, in my view, into a new regulator, and then we're back in 5 years with the same issues?
Yeah. So current non-executive leadership of any of the regulators in scope to go into the single regulator can't transfer. There's no automaticity. They can't simply transfer into the new body. Government would run a fresh campaign to recruit new leadership at non-exec level into the new regulator, and as I say, also committed to bringing forward early appointments as soon as possible in terms of shadow board. So there's no automaticity around that, and if I may, just easier for me to say than my colleagues, obviously there has been a change in the executive leadership team since the report.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to bring in Anna in a second, but I just want to, on behalf of my constituents, get some reassurance about Thames Water. Thames Water has a restructure before the courts, which in my opinion I hope will succeed. But if it doesn't succeed, you, the government, will have to move towards special administration regime. Are you ready in every respect for that with the Treasury?
So ministers have been very clear. We prepare for every eventuality. We keep all of our preparations up to date, including for special administration, should that be required for any water company. During the course of the last 18 months, we've updated all of the necessary underpinning legislation. Whilst I'm limiting what I can say about some of the discussions underway around a market-led solution, which you just alluded to, the government is prepared for all eventualities.
So can I just question for you, Chris, please? Whatever the outcome, can my constituents who have had woeful investment in particularly foul water outflows in my constituency, and they're very concerned about that, whatever the outcome for Thames Water, you will continue your regulation regime just as if Thames Water or whatever replaces it was like any other company?
We absolutely will. I'll hand over to Helen in a second, as well as all the other controls in the price review that apply to other companies. There is an extra level of oversight and support for Thames called the turnaround oversight regime.
Want to say anything, Helen, or not? You don't have to if you want to say anything.
So what I would say is that we have had an independent monitor in place for a period of time. We have far greater scrutiny and oversight of Thames Water than any other company in the sector, precisely for the reasons as it is. It's clear that there are long-term problems that have arisen over the course of many years with Thames Water, and we're working closely with the company to ensure that there's a satisfactory resolution.
Very helpful. Thank you very much. Anna Dixon, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to come back to financial resilience of the water companies and particularly focus on the issues around so-called gearing. I'm not a financial expert, so I'll try and ask my questions in as straightforward a way as possible. My understanding of Yorkshire Water and its holding companies is that since privatisation, it's racked up debts of some 6.2 billion. And in fact, it's made its money and profiteered through interest payments on those debts, effectively getting around limitations on paying out dividends. So they always claim they don't pay dividends, but actually the way they've been making the money is on interest. And I note in your very helpful supplementary information that you provided to the committee that in March 2025, Yorkshire's gearing was sitting at around 70%. It's not by no means the highest. Obviously, we've just been discussing Thames Water at some 84.5%. I note in your you talked there about unmanageable levels of debt. Where would you set an unmanageable level of debt?
Well, I might actually turn to my Ofwat colleagues because
sure
the regulator sort of forms a view on what they regard as acceptable.
Yeah. So when we set the price control determination, we set it on the same basis for all companies, which is a notional company that has a 55% level of debt to equity. And that is intended to provide a signal as to where we see an efficient company should be operating. Companies can and are able to deviate from that notional structure, and as you point out, the Yorkshire Water is not unique in the sense that it has gearing that is above that. However, the gearing that is above that is at investors' risk, and we set returns and we set a cost of debt that is consistent with a 55% gearing.
So, are you expecting to see companies like Yorkshire Water's gearing drop from 70 to 55 over this 5-year period? Is that an expectation, or not really understanding?
It's more of it's a signal.
Right.
We had considered as we were developing the price control whether or not there should be a particular floor for the level of gearing. That is a policy that is not something that we had taken forward, but it's something that within the white paper is a consideration.
Okay, so a signal, so they could choose not to. And you say that this is sort of at investor risk, but we know, that a lot of the risk seems to sit with customers. According to your own pricing methodology, and I've seen the breakdown for Yorkshire Water bills, over 50% of the bill is split between investor returns and capital repayment, with just 39% of the bills actually going on operating costs. Are the investors really taking any risk? Are they actually putting in any money? It seems, sort of looking back over this period since privatisation, they seem to have taken a lot more out than they've put in.
I think it's fair to say that in the past, investor returns have been high, and that is why we've acted with the new powers that we were given in the Environment Act in 2021 to strengthen the controls that we have around the regulated company and how it can pay dividends. So we introduced in 2023 a measure by which companies have to declare and pay a dividend in relation to a policy that complies with what we've set out. And that policy means that they have to pay dividends that are in accordance with delivery for customers and for the environment. And we will act if companies do not do that.
In a way, customers are now paying not only for the fact that a lot of money was sort of probably more than they should have taken out in the past. also a sense in that some of the things that we thought we'd paid for didn't actually get delivered. And it's only now that there's a clawback mechanism to ensure that if they don't deliver, we don't pay. So have you any idea about how much tax customers have paid, let's just say over the last 5-year AMP period, for infrastructure investment that actually never happened?
So customers have had money returned to them in the last 5 years where companies have not delivered the performance that was expected. I do not have that number off the top of my head, but I can write to the committee if that is helpful. So that regime has been in place for the last 5 years and continues into this 5 years. We have strengthened that regime in the current price control. As you say, we have now identified measures that companies have to deliver in order to retain the investment that's been given to them.
One final point. In the shift from debt to equity, which you're signalling, there's a sort of aspiration, I think it is an aspiration, that we move away from the short-term equity sort of hedge fund type investor, I'm not going to name any specific ones, to perhaps more long-term patient capital in the form of pension fund investors and other types of investors. Is there any confidence that that aspiration is going to be met? Are you proactively trying to change the investor interest and investors in this market? Is there anything that Ofwat will actually have leverage to do?
So both debt and equity investors have a role to play, and we're keen that, given the big step up in investment that's set out in this price control, that they have access to a variety of investors. Going back to the point about investor confidence, we have a responsibility through the measures that we've taken in the price control to set a framework that is that provides the opportunity for both types of investors to achieve reasonable returns that we have benchmarked. But there are other factors, obviously, within investor confidence. Part of that is company performance itself, and part of that is broader conditions around the regulatory regime, which we have discussed.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there because I'm not an expert, but I fear that we don't have a very financially resilient sector. I fear it's not getting value for money for customers, and I worry that we're going to keep paying above the odds for another 5 years, only to find these companies effectively, taking good returns for very little for customers. But I'll leave it there.
Chris, can I go to a particular bit of what Anna was perhaps getting to, and it's this. You set the investment plan for each water company. They carry out those investments. Now, there's a suspicion amongst my constituents that when they carry out those big investments, i.e. might be building a new wastewater sewage treatment works, that they inflate the price and give it to one of their associated companies. So how can we find more transparency from water companies when they do embark on these big investments, more transparency around tendering, value for money, because what we've actually seen in the Cotswolds is some of these projects have inflated in price hugely. Now, that might be genuine, but we would like to see transparency around this.
I understand the question. There are two aspects to this. The first is proposals are put to us by companies which we scrutinise to ensure that they are fair value for customers and the environment. Most of that is around shorter term projects, not some of the large water resilience projects that I think you're talking about. For that first set of projects, we have data from other companies and we have data going back years, so we are able to benchmark companies' proposals against each other, and then layer our own engineering expertise on top of that to work out what a fair allowance for expenditure and investment is. On the major project side, we have a process of milestones. So in PR24, around £2 billion of initial money has been set aside for this £50 billion pipeline of 30 major projects. We have a process that we call a gated process, where companies have to satisfy us at various milestones that their projects are on track. We are in the process because this is a new pipeline, we are in the process, along with the department through the ministerial-led water delivery task force, of revamping the way that we benchmark those major projects for exactly the reasons that you're alluding to. Again, that's more Helen's side of the house than mine, so I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Just before you answer, Helen, I'm very keen that you do. You partially answered my question. What my constituents want to see is the process. They want to see what the tenders were. They want to see who was awarded the tender. More transparency in this whole process. You might be doing the job perfectly well, but my constituents want to see how it's done.
I missed the transparency point. On the first set of projects I described, the delivery plans and the assurance plans that go around that Helen gave an overview of, that companies are required to report to us, are going to be made public so that people can see where their money is being spent. On the major project side, one of the goals of the ministerial-led water delivery task force is exactly to throw more sunlight on this issue.
Thank you. Helen, do you want to add to that?
No,
that's very helpful, Chris. I'm going to use my chairman's authority because I've got to go at 12. I want to raise a whole new subject. And this is the whole business about the Environment Agency's role in planning. Because my constituents are fed up with planning applications, the larger planning applications coming in when they know perfectly well that the current wastewater system is not working, and the new planning application, or if it goes through, it's granted, will be make the situation worse. And actually, even in my constituents, we've also got some instances where fresh water is not actually, the supply is not adequate, and therefore new developments will make that situation worse. So the questions around this, David and Chris, is what changes you're going to make in the way the regulator, under this new regulatory regime, interacts with the planning system to make sure that, at a planning stage, excuse the pun, way back, they're looking at the local plan process so they know where the big developments are coming, way before it happens, so that they can get the infrastructure plan. But B, when the actual planning applications come in, that the right advice is being given. Now, the Environment Agency is a consultee. I gather that the water companies may become consultees. But what assurance can my constituents have that this system will be improved? And again, on a transparency point, could we see the advice that the new regulator gives to the planning authorities in relation to each development?
So perhaps, Chair, if I begin, and if my Ofwat colleagues wish to add. So one of the things we've announced in the white paper is that as a local plan is developed, that water companies should be listed as consultees in the development of the local plan. And that's about getting them involved in that process to ensure that as a plan is drawn up, that all of the issues around adequate water supply and wastewater capacity are addressed at the stage of developing the local plan. And if we can get that stage right, then any individual planning application ought to be kind of consistent with the local plan. So that's the proposition in the white paper, and we're working very closely with our colleagues in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government on that.
So could I just stop you
Yes.
there, David? There's an important point here. We know that one really big planning application in the east of the country had to be refused because there wasn't an adequate water supply. Now, I don't know whether that investment went abroad or what happened to it. But in the case of highways absolutely have a block over the planning applications in a certain area. If, in my case, I've got big trouble with motorway junctions, will the planning inspector, if these matter, either the local plan is judged to be sound or not, or when an individual application goes to appeal, will the planning inspector take these water issues really seriously? If there isn't sufficient capacity in an area, the inspector should take that very seriously, should he not? Or she not?
So the inspector should consider applications whether they're in line with the local plan, and I think what I'm saying is we need to strengthen in the development of that plan consideration of water resources and wastewater capacity, and that's what the measures announced in the white paper are intending to do. Now, obviously, I can't preempt the decision of any individual inspector on any individual planning application, but I think our judgment is there is a gap in terms of ensuring these water supply and wastewater capacity issues are adequately addressed in the system, and that's the gap we're trying to address. We're also, I mean, just worth noting, obviously we are also for major projects, we are also committing to update both the national planning policy statements for water resources and wastewater, so that for major projects that regime is up to date, and the government's also committed to bringing forward a new MPS specifically for data centres, which is obviously one of the most water intensive pieces of new infrastructure that we sort of see coming forward, and we need to ensure that where we see new infrastructure, there's a major call on water resources, that the planning system properly takes account of that. So there will be a new MPS which will include water resources issues coming forward as well.
You've dealt with 3/4 of my question, but the final quarter again, which is on transparency. My constituents get driven mad when a planning application comes along when they see there isn't adequate wastewater treatment plants, for example. Can we see more of the evidence that the new regulator gives to the local planning authority, what their evidence actually is? Because my constituents would like to see that.
Could I take your question about transparency away and perhaps come back to the committee with a more considered response?
I'm absolutely delighted you should say that. Thank you.
What I would just like to highlight, though, is some work underway with NISTA, National Infrastructure Authority, on a new planning tool that they've been developing for new infrastructure called Align. And one of the things that does is take all of the available data around wastewater and water resources information and put that into the model. So it's intended to give all the relevant agencies a much better handle on where do we see capacity constraints in the system, and therefore better informed judgments about where new infrastructure should go.
That's extremely helpful. Can I apologise to the witnesses and to my colleagues? I have to leave this morning for another appointment in my constituency, so I'm leaving now, but my very able Deputy Clive Betts will take over from me. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Right, do you want to move us around? Right, could I just begin by following up on the Chair's question about planning? I think it's really helpful what you said about the requirements on local plans in future to look at these issues. The problem is, by the time the rules are changed, we're going to have probably half the country or more with a local plan in place for the next 15 years or more. What's going to happen in those situations?
So what I've described is sort of trying to strengthen the system, but clearly we would, even today, you know, in the current arrangements, ideally you would expect planning authorities to be taking account of water and water supply issues, wastewater capacity issues. We are trying through the delivery task force that my colleague mentioned earlier, where we see obvious problems, we're sort of trying to come up with some bespoke solutions. So we've done that in Oxford, we've done that in Cambridge, and we've recently done that in North Sussex to try and ensure that bespoke arrangements can be put in place, sometimes involving work with the water companies around upgrading capacity to allow so that applications are not blocked. So we haven't got a full and accurate set of data on those things right now, but where we get intelligence of problems, we're putting in place arrangements to try and fix them.
Okay. Any thought that you might want to contact all the authorities with a local plan in place and say, look, this is what's going to be required in the future? Did you ought to have a think about whether your current plan actually addresses these issues properly?
Yeah, I think that's a good challenge, Chair. I'm happy to take that one away.
Sarah, do you want to go
on that point,
yes.
Chair, there are authorities, including mine in Buckinghamshire, which are currently in the process of drafting their local plan while meeting the new housing targets that they've been set. And I strongly suspect the timeframe we're talking about will come after they are required to submit their proposal. So this is a live issue in some parts of the country, and I'd be keen, as part of your response when you write back to the committee, to understand how you intend to influence existing live local plans being drafted now, given what the direction of travel is.
We could come back with a sort of considered response to all the
Yeah.
points raised, and how the local plan process fits with the water resources management plans, which are aimed to sort of address these issues. But I think I accept, there are some things we need to do to strengthen the system.
That would be very helpful,
Yeah.
thank you. Coming back to the issue we raised before, just to make sure we got this right. We talked about the regulation of water companies and then about the parent or holding companies. I think we were told that they aren't currently regulated and won't be in future. Is that did we hear correctly?
Our powers are related to the regulated entity.
Could you just convert that into language perhaps we can all understand clearly? Yeah.
We regulate the companies, the regulated entity. The holding companies may be in jurisdictions that are outside our powers.
They're outside?
But what we have put in place is clear controls, ring-fenced conditions around the companies that are regulated to ensure that there is a clear set of controls to keep protections around the regulated company.
So if I could just add, it's common in economic regulation across all sectors for the regulator's power to be self-evidently at the level of the regulated company. And here that means controlling the money that leaves the regulated company to go somewhere else. It's not common and would be a very significant shift in economic regulation generally for that to expand to holding companies. And say it expands by one level of holding companies, what is to stop organisations setting up holding companies for the holding companies, and the regulations expanding.
They do, don't they?
And soon, economic regulators of utilities would effectively be financial regulators. That would be a very, very significant shift in what oversight of regulated sectors is.
Essentially, you are financial regulators, aren't you, in the water industry?
We are financial regulators for the companies that we regulate. I'm sorry if that's a tautology. But
yes. Anna, you want to go in?
Yes, I do just want to probe on this because, again, I've looked into Yorkshire Water, these 9 holding companies, who, it's not that they're doing other businesses, they are all created for moving money around and, making money out of various debt and interest payments and paying the CEO, as we heard at the top of the session, sort of extra payments out with regulated bonuses and salaries. And so I really worry that if you don't have any purview, how can you properly regulate the regulated entity and ensure its financial resilience without having a purview or some control or having some say about the wider holding companies?
Perhaps I can pick that up in terms of the powers that I mentioned that we were given earlier in the Environment Act. And that is to put a ring fence around the regulated company for precisely the reasons. These are designed to ensure that the regulated company operates independently and maintains financial and operational stability when it's part of a larger group. I can talk about some of the conditions, but the dividend condition that I mentioned earlier is one of those safeguards.
Then we've just heard about Yorkshire Water slipping money through its parent companies to its chief executive. Yorkshire Water may not be the company doing that. They are the company's regulator, but the slipping of money from the parent company isn't regulated. So isn't that just a clear example of where the current system doesn't work?
So the payment from the parent company to the individual is something that we do not regulate. We regulate where a payment has been made to the chief executive out of the regulated company. But your point is absolutely right, that there needs to be transparency and a rationale, and companies should explain why these payments are justified.
Or regulate the parent company to at least an extent as well. Anyway, that's probably a policy issue that you can't comment on. It's something we might come back to. You mentioned before about the customers. What I want to finish with my questions on. Customers, and presumably most people watching this are customers, will feel, well, the shareholders are being looked after and the officials of the water company are being looked after. But what about us? And I think Anna Dixon asked a question about the customer and what happened when schemes were not carried out that they had paid for. You said, well, actually, money's returned to them. But Yorkshire Water got fined because it allowed sewage discharges to a high degree. So it got fined for that. So I said, well, are the customers going to get the benefit? No, the money's going to the Treasury. So the customers have paid for that work to be done to improve sewage overflows. Customers have paid and the Treasury's got the benefit.
It is true that fines go to Treasury, but in the majority of the wastewater cases that we have concluded, companies that offer us undertakings in lieu of enforcement, which give us the position, give us the power to direct investment, to remediate the problem, to prevent it happening in future, and also to do more for communities.
If I may, just on a clarification, so fines are now hypothecated, so they don't sit in the Treasury, they're returned to us in something called the Water Restoration Fund, and they are spent now on projects to improve the water environment. But with one caveat to that, they must not be spent on something a water company should be doing itself. So I think we've got something like £29 million of fines now coming back to the department and then for dispersal into local projects. So that's a new innovation rather than the money just going into the Treasury.
Is that hypothecated back to the area where the fines were levied?
So not directly, but we try and make sure in where those projects are supported that there's a good geographical distribution of the money.
Going back to the wider issue of customers, when a look is had for the 5-year price review, account is taken of the need for investment and the shareholders and their returns, but it all seems the customer comes somewhere down at the end. Affordability really isn't one of the issues that's addressed, is it?
No, affordability is addressed, and the customer interest is addressed. The PR24 included more protection and more support for customers than ever before, in addition to there were record levels of investment and very significant bill increases as a consequence of that. And but we do understand how difficult that can be. Part of my job involves talking directly to members of the public as well as their elected representatives like you. We hear those concerns firsthand, and we do understand them. But that's why there is more protection and more support in those PR24 final determinations than ever before. That protection extends to, as we were discussing earlier, ensuring that customers' money is ring-fenced for investment, and there are mechanisms to claw it back and return it to them in the form of lower bills if that investment is not realised. And it includes support for those struggling to pay. Using what are called social tariffs, the percentage of customers eligible for social tariffs, shareholder-funded social tariffs, doubled in this price review.
Yes, that at one level could be seen to be helping those in need, quite rightly. Another level, it could be seen that the prices are actually getting more unaffordable to more people. So really that's not been taken to the heart of the issue, is it?
I think that is a very fundamental question. Part of the criticism that Ofwat has received that's featured in the Independent Water Commission, as I was mentioning earlier, is that bills have been kept artificially low in inverted commas, not an allegation that I accept for the record. But there are certainly people that think the price review process has been too pro-customer, as I said earlier, and not the converse.
I think most customers will think now they're going to pay an awful lot more for services they should have been receiving and still aren't in many cases.
Absolutely, and that's why we see in the Independent Water Commission exactly that analysis, that this patchwork quilt of regulation has led to gaps and overlaps and inconsistencies in responsibilities, and a significant level of investment is needed to catch up. But the reforms in the white paper exactly have the goal of preventing that kind of bill shock in future.
And just in terms of the white paper and going forward and having a national water strategy, is that simply the case of doing more over a longer period?
That sort of picking up on what I was saying earlier about the government giving a clearer sense of what are the big priorities for the sector over a longer period. So, and I would expect to see that reflected in the government's future guidance and directions to the new regulator. We also have said very explicitly that we will set an objective for the new regulator about bills, customer bills being fair and affordable. So that will be written into the 4 or 5 objectives that they must work towards.
What's the CMA's role in going forward in the new system? They're still going to have a role?
A different role. So the main change we're proposing in relation to the CMA is, obviously currently they perform that function of an independent appeal mechanism against the Ofwat currently's determinations. We envisage there will continue to be that appeal mechanism, but instead of the current arrangements where if you appeal, it's a full redetermination of the whole price review settlement, it will be much more targeted on a specific issue, which is how it's done in other economic regulated sectors.
And would they have a responsibility to look at affordability for customers as well?
Well, they'll. I mean, they will have to conduct the appeal in line with the regulatory objectives of the system as a whole. They won't be able to sort of take a different view. They have to. But I don't know, Helen, if you want to add to that.
The CMA currently substitutes its judgment for Ofwat's and is subject to the goals that we are subject to. In a new system where it's judicial review, I think it remains to be seen what criteria the CMA will use when it comes to the redetermination process.
There'd be a direction to the CMA in the end. They're set up as a public body to carry out the public's will.
So we're not, in any system, I would expect that the CMA will have to undertake its decision making in an appeal capacity on the same basis that the.
Can we have a note about that? Just
happy
to clarify.
to do.
Sure. Will be helpful.
Yeah.
And finally, there's a word in the proposals that we're going to have a supervisory approach. What exactly does that mean, and why is it different to what we have now?
Shall I have a go at that? So, what that means, and this was again something that Sir John Cunliffe looked at hard and looked at experience in other sectors, is that you establish in the regulator a capability to really, on a company by company basis, understand quite deeply the specific, technical, engineering challenges, infrastructure challenges facing a particular company, and you build a company-specific regulatory capability and expertise, whereas quite a lot of the current approach is based on a kind of economic modelling, looking across the sector as a whole. So it's not dropping all of that, but it is giving you that company-specific view of how the company should be regulated.
So you'd have officials who are specifically allocated to look at and understand and work at proposals with a particular company.
Yes, so that stronger engineering capacity I talked about, they might get to know in much finer detail the particular engineering challenges facing, which can be quite different in different parts of the country depending on the nature of the legacy infrastructure and so on.
Right. Any of the members got any issues like to pick up? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. And I've got some words I've got to read out, but they've been given to the chair and I haven't quite got them in front of me, so must get them right. Right. Well, obviously, thank you for coming and get that bit right without having too hard. Given this, I think it's been an interesting session looking at the challenges now, but also what could change and what will change going forward. An uncorrected transcript of this hearing will be published on the committee's website in the coming days. The committee then will consider the evidence it's received and produce a report in due course. Order. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.